the Oversight Board on issues that are within the Oversight Board's purview and not on the agenda. Each speaker is allowed 3 minutes, and our light is working today. So, Mr. Kidwai.
I begin in the name of our God, who is most beneficial, most merciful. My name is Nick Iqbal Kidwai. I'm a resident of Newberry Park and Director of Concerned Citizen Thousand Oaks since 1993. I want to again vehemently object to your having the meeting in the middle of the day, so taxpayers cannot participate, and I have to give up a whole afternoon of work to barely make it over here, and this affects the pocketbooks of so many, and we have reporters that don't do their homework, and we don't have a local agency, so the Thousand Oaks Acorn put down 5 o'clock. And I said, well, I don't think that's right, and it was not right. That's on their front page news. I do want to address the items on the agenda today, so I really should not be taking too much time on the public comments, but as I have a tendency, I remember things like I was here on Monday and ran from downstairs, barely made it, but the TV cameras were on. We are paying for it. I pay, it's disgusting the amount of money that I pay FIOS for the city franchise fee. In fact, Mr. Adams told me that the franchise fee doesn't really have to go to the cable, it goes to the general fund. I don't know if that is legally correct, but I have a lot of respect for Mr. Adams though. I must say, very disappointed in the work of the board so far. And I'm disappointed that Mr. Durst is not here today. I don't know if he's like a wonderful counsel that goes on European vacations, if he's already on his vacation. But he did say once that our job is to wind down these projects, and I have not seen anything done on the board to do that, and in fact it's just the opposite. I see the yellow light and I take strong exception. There is a council candidate now, Mr. Mick Ferris, who changed the 3 minutes to 5 minutes, which is used to be for the Planning Commission. And all you have to do is make a motion and ask that, in fact, there should be no time limit, so long as people speak to the agenda and are within reasonable, don't want to hear half an hour of dissertations. But there is no reason for that, especially when you have it at 3 in the afternoon, somebody is sacrificing Mr. Jeff Barstead, the time and giving up making taxes so that we can support all these fine things to hold people. No wonder, I mean, nobody wants to participate because you folks have just made a mockery of the whole democratic process. Also, I would like to just say that I will speak on the agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kidwai. Action items, the January 1st through June 30th, 2013 recognized obligation payment schedule, and John Adams, the Finance Director, will be doing the report.
Thank you, Mayor Owen, or Chair Owen, I should say. This afternoon, staff is providing you what we are considering ROPS 3. This is the ROPS, or Required Obligation Payment Schedule, that will cover January 2013 through June 2013. We call it ROPS 3 because it's the third ROPS that this board will be asked to adopt. Today you'll be adopting a resolution approving the proposed ROPS that is in your packet. I'm going to spend just a few seconds or a few minutes talking about some of the changes from the last ROPS that you've seen. First, the ROPS is due or due for approval by the board by September 1st. As you know, this is our last, or at least the last scheduled board meeting prior to September 1st. That's why it's here today in front of you. The prior ROPS that we have provided to you were actually broken out into 3 different sources: Thousand Oaks Boulevard, Newberry Park, or Newberry Road project area, and then the housing. Gotten direction from the County Auditor Controller that we're allowed to combine all 3 onto one form. Just talking about what is new, you'll see a lot of the same obligations are carrying forward. Dollar amounts may be a little bit different as far as what is new. On page 4 of your packet, it talks about the four items which are new on this ROPS. Item 8, which is the Los Feliz housing project, admin support for a project, a low income housing project that the former agency is working with Area Housing Authority. The second one is the Hillcrest apartment project, again working with our with the OPA. The other one, item 11, due diligence review. Part of the new law, 1484, requires a due diligence review by licensed CPAs to determine unencumbered balances. And so our estimated cost in January of 2013 is $10,000. And then line 7, which is Form B, West Side property maintenance, which is another item on tonight's agenda, is for costs associated with managing the buildings and the leases on the west side, which is the property next to Civic Arts Plaza. So I covered Form A, Form B. Form A is paid from future tax increment, or what we are calling the RPPTF fund. Form B is being paid from other sources, or what we call reserves. And then Form C is really covering the administrative allowance. The law allows for 3% of the total money received from the tax fund. We are not at the minimum, or we are at the minimum, which is $250,000. So that's for administration costs for fiscal year 2012-2013. On page 6, we briefly talk about the 4 items that were disallowed by the DOF. As you recall, there were 4 items that this board approved to be forwarded to the DOF, even though the DOF had provided a prior denial based on our POPS. After working with the DOF and exhausting efforts, we removed the Local Housing Trust Fund contribution. Item 3 and 4, which is the Thousand Oaks Boulevard undergrounding utility project and utility road acquisition improvements project. Since those are being funded by bond proceeds, AB 1484 provides the ability, if certain requirements are met, to be able to spend those proceeds in the future. At this point, they're not on the ROPS. They will be on a future ROPS once we meet those obligations. May be on ROPS 4, which will cover July 2013 through December 2013, or might be on ROPS 5, which will be in the next calendar of 2014. But those 3 items are not included. The one item that is included for the board's consideration is the Discovery Center. The current discussion and analysis is providing the report. Staff's recommending one last attempt with the DOF to provide additional information to them, or to have further discussions on our concerns as far as why that's an obligation. With that said, the reason why staff is making one more attempt is part of the new law, 1484, AB 1484, will require CPAs or accountants to come in and do a analysis on the funds that we have on, that the RDA, former RDA has. And based on that analysis, the agency will have to turn over unobligated cash at that point, as late as April of next year. And when that cash is gone, there will not be a chance of funding the Discovery Center if that becomes a true obligation. So staff is recommending to continue to leave that on the ROPS for one last attempt for ROPS number 3. And with that, staff is really open for any questions that the board may have.
Questions to staff? Mr.
Jack, I've got a couple.
Oh.
When we look at, and I'm just looking at the discussion analysis summary, staffing costs for the housing project and for the apartment project, and for the West Side property maintenance and management fee, what differentiates that from the administrative costs that are included in the $250,000 lump sum?
The way we understand the law is that the administrative is for the winding down of the RDA affairs. The 8 and 9 is related to specific projects that were approved by the former agency and monitoring costs to help fulfill the obligations for the OPA. So it's really a cost related to fulfilling those requirements, those contractual obligations. And that's different than the administrative allowance.
Which is just a general fee for doing
yes.
what's got to be done.
Correct. And then let me clarify, Dr. Barstead, on Form B, the West Side property maintenance. That is, and we'll talk about it on, I think, one of the item B, the properties that are owned next door are owned by the former agency, and we have tenants on that. And so part of that is we are managing those, those tenants have facility staff. Prior facility staff used to be charged the redevelopment agency for services if there was a leak or whatever. It's the same concept. So the difference is that's being funded from rental income coming in, not being funded from the tax. The trust fund it's coming from the revenue received from the tenants.
Okay. So back to the $250,000 fee, that is just basically the cost of doing business of the successor agency, essentially being reimbursed to the city through this process. And it's
correct.
And it's calculated in the statutes.
Right. Originally, on page 5, I think that shows you what the language is in AB 26, which says that it's 3% of your allocation from the redevelopment property tax trust fund, or 250,000, whatever's less. Just for your information, if you take this amount this year, which is, or this 6 month is about 1.7, and you take what we did last time, which is about 6.5, we don't meet. We're at about $9 million, so we're certainly short of the 3%. The 250 is the minimum we can receive.
The final question having to do with the Discovery Center.
Yes.
When I was reading the materials prior to the meeting, especially as it relates to the trailer bills that were passed as part of the budget, my reading of it was that the Department of Finance has now been given basically final authority to overturn any ROP that we send forward as a local successor agency board if they believe it's inappropriate.
That is a true statement. I mean, certainly the DOF with the AB 1484 has a lot more authority, a lot more final determination on things. And that's, we talk about why we included it, but that's also the other aspect is the DOF will review all your actions and determine if they're in compliance. So on this one, it's the same thing. It's the last, we believe it's the last ditch effort.
And I guess this question would be directed to Mr. Fletcher, but other than if we had some sort of philosophical disagreement with even trying a third time, there's no liability to the board to approving the staff going forward with, this is our legal argument for including the Discovery Center, and we'd like to have DOF's final opinion. Is there any liability to us as a board? Are we doing anything wrong by saying, let's give the city one more shot at this?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it's actually making that argument. And there really is no downside. And if you don't make it, but you can never ripen your argument to, if you want to somehow potentially litigate it or something. I mean, there's more and more litigation coming out of this. You got to put it out there and make your case in any event. So no downside.
Thank you.
Mr. Warner?
Yeah, kind of on the same lines as the number 7 on Form B and a couple other items where the city's being paid basically a fee for monitoring, or in this case it says maintenance costs and property management. That's a fixed fee? That's not based on actual hours or costs?
I think when we calculate it was a percentage, isn't that?
Madam Chair, Bill Hatcher, City Planner. With regard to the 2 housing projects, those are estimates. The one project, I believe number 9, is the Hillcrest project, which is under construction and is winding down as far as the agency's obligations are concerned. So we have some follow-up with regard to construction contracts, issuance of notice of completion. The other area housing authority project is a little bit of more of an unknown quantity. They're in the process of trying to obtain tax credit funding. And so if they are successful in obtaining that funding, there would be quite a bit of staff work involved in terms of amending an OPA and new loan agreements and that type of thing. So what we've tried to do is come up with the best hourly estimate that we're able to do with the information we have right now.
And would that be billed from the city monthly? We're seeing a kind of a lump sum on a couple of those in January, but would that eventually just be a monthly?
Not necessarily, because of the flow of the projects. There would be quite a bit of work associated, assuming, say, for instance, the Area Housing Authority project. If they get their funding, then there would be a lump of work related to amending the OPA and new loan agreements and closing construction financing, and then there could be a period of time where there's much less staff involvement. So it's not going to be necessarily an even flow.
I guess my question is, are we paying ahead, or are we paying after the costs are incurred?
Well, may I answer that? We're not necessarily paying ahead. What we're saying is that we anticipate that these costs might occur during this time frame. And because we've been instructed that project-related costs should come out of the RPTTF as opposed to the successor agency admin, we're just saying we think it's possible this amount of money might be expended, but we wouldn't draw from it unless we actually began to have project-related costs.
And then on the West Side property maintenance, how's that, the $1,800 a month?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Adams on that.
It's based, I mean, we will, you know, for that facility, we do it based on change or work orders. So service, if there's roof repairs, if there's other items that are occurring. Our facilities group is responsible for that. If they have a leak or whatever, it could be those costs as well related to maintenance, things that are obligations to be paid.
So again, though, this isn't being paid.
Yeah, it's
nothing
not,
happens. It's only an estimate based on.
correct, and you know, a lot of them. I mean, I can tell you the bond payments. I know exactly what those dollar amounts are, but there's a lot of other stuff that's based on that will ultimately be based on cost that needs to be supported, and there will be audited and taken, you know, to look at supporting documentation. So, I do want to make a couple comments because I'm trying to look at the Form A, because I think you asked a question and I should have pointed it out. We received allocations from the tax fund in June related to ROPS 2, which is the July through December period of time. The obligations listed were more than were in the trust fund, and so the agency or the successor agency, the obligations that were ultimately approved not just by the board but the DOF, there was enough money to pay those obligations, and so some of those obligations are being carried forward from that aspect. And a good example is number 6. Originally the estimate was $76,000 for the year. That $38,000 represents the potential reimbursement in January for money that was not available to reimburse for June through December. So to sort of answer your question, all of these costs are estimates will be based on actuals. We'll have supporting documentation, and ultimately for that $38,000 is the expenses that were occurring now that weren't reimbursed based on the original allocation from the trust fund.
So when those expenses occur, do we see that here at the board?
You know,
because we haven't seen any monthly accounting. We've approved a ROPS that said we're going to spend this amount of money.
Right.
And if they're estimates.
And that's something certainly we should probably, I mean, you know, focusing on getting the obligation schedules and getting the funding to pay for those expenses that, you know, the way that the accounting works is that the city has set up a quote-unquote trust fund from a true governmental accounting perspective. That trust fund will be part of our annual audit. So we are segregating all expenses related to that, and that's something that certainly we can provide the board as we complete our fiscal year on the listing of expenditures and then going forward as well.
And maybe comparison versus
Yeah,
what
and
the schedule's showing.
yes. And again, you know, I think you brought it up at the last meeting, are some of these numbers realistic as far as being able to be spent and you know, when you're projecting out expenditures, 6 to 8 months, will they actually occur? I'm not 100% sure, but those are the estimates at those points, so.
And then I guess the only final question is, what happens if we fall into a situation again where we underestimated? Is there an amendment to a ROPS to be able to accommodate that?
You know, the DOF on the most recent ROPS 2 stopped any future amendments. I mean, there was a point in time that they said no more future ones. The new legislation, and maybe I'll let Joe talk about it, or I can at least mention it, that it does provide the ability to set up reimbursement agreement between the city and the successor agency. So if it's something that is a true obligation that is paid for, there's the potential of the city expensing the money and being paid back at the next ROPS.
No more questions?
Thank you, Ms. Ingram.
Just sort of following up on the line of questioning that occurred earlier. For example, of the items that were disallowed on the previous ROPS number 2, there are items for the local housing trust fund contribution, the Thousand Oaks Boulevard Utility Undergrounding Project, and the Kelly Road acquisition are not included in this current ROPS, but could be in a future one. The Discovery Center commitment is being included in this ROPS.
Correct.
I guess my question is, my understanding that this is essentially like a bankruptcy. You pay all the bills, or you add up all the bills, you see what's there, then you start cutting because you can't pay for everything, and then what's left over is supposed to go to the state, and a piece of that comes to, for example, my campus.
Right.
Now, if you're allowed to carry forward debts from ROPS that couldn't be paid at the time, at what point is it the DOF or somebody cut it off and say, okay, enough?
Well,
We got to have money left over, or
right. Let me try to make a clarification. I think when we give you the legislative update, AB 1484 has a few key points in time. For some people, the most recent one was July 12th, in which the agency, based on a demand letter from the county, based on direction by the state, made a payment of $2.6 million to the county to be distributed to taxing entities. That was one. The next one is, I believe it's November 28th, based on the review of how much money we have in the low mod fund that's unobligated. And that cash at that point, once it's reviewed and approved by the board and then approved by DOF, will be sent to the state for distribution. And the third one is based on the January review, that a payment will be made, I think, by April 10th. And that money will be then allocated. So this is really that last time. And your question is, at what point do you say, there's no money to pay it? That last payment in that April 10th will be when we have no more reserves or no more other sources as far as funding for the successor agency. So the answer to your question is April 10th.
2013.
2013. But that audit, and I can talk about that later, that audit needs to be prepared and done prior to, I believe it's January 1st. So we have to engage in that sooner and have it in front of the board prior to, I think it's January 1st or January 15th.
And that would include a reconciliation of the actuals versus what you projected.
Actually, the reconciliation would be saying these are the obligations, this is how much cash is on hand, here's the difference, this difference needs to be remitted to the state for distribution and taxing entities. So by putting it on by putting the Discovery Center on and making the argument of that obligation is not impacting one way or the other the taxing entities at this point, because even if it wasn't an obligation or is deemed as not an obligation, it's not going to be paid to you. your campus or to the state until April 10th.
So it's not treated like, for example, an encumbrance?
Even from our perspective, if it was considered an encumbrance, you wouldn't be able to liquidate that encumbrance until April 10th, and you have to turn over the money. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we have two speakers. Our first speaker is John Bradley.
Chair, members of the board, I'm John Bradley, and I'm the chair of the Discovery Center Board. We've spoken in the past, and I'm here merely to kind of reemphasize the importance, in our view, of the staff report that you've already heard, the discussion you've already had. Obviously, we're strongly in favor of you taking whatever action is possible in order to protect the future of the Discovery Center. One thing I'd like to remind you about, and we talked about it last time, is that when the Discovery Center did accept the obligation of the $5 million, that was the key to the start of the fundraising campaign and reliance upon it. As we've spoken before, we did get just under $1 million in gifts, a couple of major gifts that were total the $750,000 range. So there was some reliance in the community upon going forward with this project, and we would like to be able to continue to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. And Mr. Kidwise.
Three minutes is really inadequate to address all the issues, and it's really a violation of citizens' rights when you're talking about so many issues and comments from the board that really need to be replied to. I'll handle the last one first, this bogus Discovery Center. I mean, I have a degree in biochemistry. My wife has worked for Amgen. She's working in science right now. All my siblings are physicians and all that. I have nothing. I mean, I'm an admirer of science. I would like to contribute to the Discovery Center, but no one on the board has asked the city manager the question, which I brought this before. In open session, the city manager said that we cannot do this project because it's way beyond our budget or the capability of this. I cannot put words in his mouth. It's $45 million, that's what it came out to, and it's not doable. And that's why he said, rest in peace, basically. I wasted a whole morning, a Friday morning. A school board member came with me, talked to the finance director and Mr. Mitnick in January about these obligations. And the sum total was, I got an email with a bond link. Mr. Dursey is not here. I don't do this full time, but what is happening here is that one bond is being used for 3 or 4 or 2 projects. You cannot do that, and that's why your job is, and I hope that the vice chair would step forward, ask for an accounting, an independent accounting of these bonds as to what the projects they were used for. Then we will have a clear understanding that the bond in 2005 was for the Discovery Center. We cannot believe the staff because the staff has really not provided the true accounting. Not all, and Mr. Barstead says, well, at what time are we accountable? You're accountable to the citizens of the city, of the state. And when they give you frivolous, bogus documents, it's your responsibility to have them investigated. That's your responsibility. And not like has been said in the past, let's throw some things at the state and see if they pass. I want to thank staff for putting my information there. I was led around the wrong path. The Department of Finance cannot handle things that are not on the ROPS, and so projects like the West Side properties and the Auto Mall, etc., are being handled by the State Controller's Office, and they are being not as good as the DOF. That's all I can say. I would encourage some of the board members, I don't know if it's allowed, to contact the department, the controllers, and ask them to come in and investigate and get to the bottom of these things. Also, well, can I finish one point? I'm not talking about personal things. Is that the 72-hour rule has been abolished, not because Governor Brown was against it or anything. It's because of the misuse by the cities and the counties in billing for agendas. That's what is happening over here. We need to, you folks, and what we do in the private sector, Mrs. Irwin, is give an accounting. They should put on a time card. You do it on the computer now. Which time they start on working on the RDA, what time they stop. And then the actual amounts, you'll find that they are overbilling by thousands of dollars. They've overbilled by millions in the past. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Mr. Kidwai.
Ms. Irwin?
Yes.
I would
Ms.
like to
Barth?
move that we approve or adopt the resolution approving and certifying the January 1 to June 30, 2013 recognized obligation payment schedule, including the administrative allowance.
Okay. Comments? Second?
I'll second.
Can I have a second? Vote? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Item 7D, renegotiation of leases for properties located at 1934, 1938, 1948 East Thousand Oaks Boulevard. And again, our finance director will be presenting the report.
I'm lucky today. Let me just talk about staff's recommendation is to get approval from the Oversight Board or direction to renegotiate or to negotiate leases, new leases with the current tenants on the west side parcels. Next door, I think we had a map. Part of page 20 actually shows you property that is owned next door on the west side of the Civic Arts Plaza, which has 4 current tenants. We showed you that the current use is a small check place, an auto glass landscape company, and a wine yard or wine bar. Those leases, for the most part, were executed in 2006, different market, different rates. They came and expired during late 2011, actually several of them in September of 2011. City staff at that point, facilities management, was negotiating or discussing lease amendments with them right around May and June of 2011. The budget and the elimination of redevelopment agencies occurred in June of 2011 in the state and the court. Based on those actions, we were not able to finalize or execute those lease amendments. Since then, they've been on a month-to-month. I will say we've done our best to maintain collections. We have at least 2 tenants that are at least a month behind. It has been a challenge. We have at least one time given a pay rent or cease notice by our police department. They paid, but we have had requests to renegotiate rates. We're asking this board to direct staff to renegotiate rates with the current tenants based on current market conditions, and coming back to this board in September with suggested or renegotiated lease agreements for your approval. It is also our understanding that the successor agency that council may need to also approve it, but we're still working through that. But this board has to give us direction to renegotiate. We'll renegotiate the leases and bring them back for your approval. And with that, leave it to any questions.
Ms. Burns?
I guess my question, I don't necessarily have a problem with reducing the amount of the rent. My question is, how long of a lease are you going to negotiate? That's my concern more than that.
Good question. I should have probably covered that. AB 1484 talks about how you dispose of assets, specifically land, and you have to have a management plan. I believe that will start occurring early next year, and I believe we need to have something in front of you June 2013.
Within 6 months of the final payment,
The final
getting
payment.
our certificate of completion.
Yeah, so we're talking probably getting them through next summer. I think that would give us enough time in case, how do I say, the final payment is due to the county, or to the county, April 10th. So we have to provide you a property management plan within 6 months of that. So I think from that perspective, there'll be a decision on how to, what we do with those assets. So I think if we do a lease from current through next June, I think that won't have any impacts.
And I guess that initially I was thinking that a shorter term, as you're suggesting, would be appropriate. Then on the other hand, I was thinking, well, but if one was putting the property up for sale, is that property worth more if it has a long-term, you know, already has a lease with tenants that are already tied to it?
That, again, it's a month-to-month lease, and we should just leave it at that. I mean, it is month-to-month, and if they vacate the lease and they vacate the property, it'll stay empty. So.
I think as Mr. Mitnick mentions, it's currently a month-to-month. I think the question becomes if, you know, again, it's generating about $100,000 in rental income. And if you go and look at, you know, is it better to have it vacant, not earning, or having money, that's sort of the challenge. The question for a few of the tenants, specifically the landscaping company, is they're not an easy company for them to relocate, and giving them 30 days notice in a very short period of time, there's some concerns on their part. And I think that's the other aspect is we have tenants that have, you know, we have the landscaping company who has been an excellent tenant, has been paying on time. And I think we, the board and the staff, owe them that aspect of we want to keep it month to month, and you need to start looking for another place because it could happen at any time, or we give them some assurance on how long that lease is. Either way, from the staff perspective, I don't think anything will happen with that property until early 2013.
Ms. Amber?
Question. I would assume that absent a plan for the disposition of the property, the city still has an obligation for the highest and best use. So it's to maximize the value of the asset, and I would think that whether you sell it or keep it, maximizing the revenue that is generated from that asset is what's optimal. So for example, if there are people, tenants month to month who are not paying, and you've given them the 3-day pay rent or quit, it's out the door, get somebody else. But at the same time, you don't negotiate a lease that's going to be beyond the period of time in which you might dispose of the property, correct?
Yes, and I think kicking them out and hoping to find someone that, the buildings are not in the best condition. Certainly, there needs to be improvements. We don't want to put those investments in there. So having a current tenant that may pay a little less, but at least is paying, is certainly more optimal than kicking them out. And certainly, that has been the challenge over the last few months of do we kick them out or keep them, because if we kick them out, the chance of replacing them with a tenant on a month-to-month would be very difficult. So from that perspective, I think we want to talk with all of them, see what their needs are, and then come back with sort of their proposals.
Well, what I'm struggling with is my role as the board member is to maximize the value of that asset.
Right.
And if at point X it's to be sold and the proceeds go to the state, then I guess what we need is a plan that says, what do you need to do now that will maximize the future value of that asset? And if it's to lower the rent for some of the tenants, keep the rent the same for the ones who already pay, then I guess that's the direction or advice I'm looking for.
I'd like to interject. Madam Chair, members of the board, for clarification, this property is institutional zone, and the intent here is not to, for the redevelopment agency's intent was not to enter into long-term lease agreements or to have a long-term source of revenue. The intent and the goal from day one was to get the tenants off the property, and they were on a month-to-month until they were done. It was that simple. A regional art museum is anticipated to be on the site, and that's why it has institutional zone. It does not have a commercial zone or for-profit use anticipated for it. So the goal is not to stay with these tenants for the long term.
Are you then saying then that whenever those tenants leave, that land would then be assigned from the redevelopment, if you will, to the city?
That's the expectation. These buildings are old, a lot of them are dilapidated.
I understand that, but what I also understand then is that if it comes to the city, then that property continues to be off tax rolls. And then there's no revenue, property tax revenue generated for any of them.
That's correct. That's also reflective of the zoning on the property. And we'll get into this later when we deal with the disposition of assets and property. That's not on the agenda for tonight.
Because I would like some, advice from our council in terms of what we're supposed to do in terms of maximizing our return.
Under the original act as well as the amendment, there's a requirement to dispose of property, and the statute talks about properties put to a public use or designated for public purpose can be conveyed to a public agency, whether it's a school, some potential school site, fire station site, museum site. Property that's not is supposed to be marketed, and that's where you get into a conversation about maximizing the return. But that is not yet on your agenda. That's a program that the staff has to bring back to you. But that will be this discussion, is which properties appropriately under the law can be kept by the agency or by the city or another public agency, the park district or the school districts or something, and which have to be put back into the marketplace.
On that property, since they're commercially zoned, when was that institutional zone placed? Was that recent?
Yeah, recently in the last several months. So it does not have a commercial zone.
Do you think that would have devalued the property, that decision?
The Regional Art Museum has been in the works for several years, and that project has been in front of the council for many years, well before this legislation.
The other comments or concerns I have, since we looked at on the ROPS, we had about a $2,700 a month operating cost to maintain these properties between the management fee and maintenance fee estimates. That if, right now that's probably running about 25% already, so we're seeing, 75%, revenue. That if we start lowering these rents too much at some point, I don't know how much, sense it's gonna make versus the work. But the question, what happens with that revenue?
It stays within the agency, the successor agency, and is just used to offset operation and the trust fund allocation. Right now, the difference is that we have reserves, and we have money that ultimately will probably be handed over to the state, and so it's all being kept within the trust fund. I think at some point, when you look at Form B, there's a lot of projects out there that are being funded by current reserves. Once the unobligated money is sent to the state, that money will still stay in the trust fund and will be funding other costs. So any revenue that's being generated is staying within the successor agency within the trust fund, and will reduce the impacts to the taxing entities that receive money from property tax trust fund. So it's all being kept within the trust fund for the successor agency. And let me talk about the maintenance. I think that what people need to understand is that includes things like utility bills, and that type of cost, and those are estimates based on what our current costs are. So it's not, when you say management fee and how much, it's going to be on time and materials and direct reimbursement for those costs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, well, if it doesn't include utilities, I think just generally speaking, I don't know how everyone else feels, but I think those should be paid for by the actual tenant, because when you pay for them, then people just run the bills up. They don't really care what they're spending on energy or water or anything else, opposed to reducing the rent and making them pay for the utilities. But
understood.
We can pursue that, absolutely.
And that would make sense.
Yeah, we'll do it.
Dr. Barstow, did you have something?
I just want to restate what I think you just said, because I was curious about the accounting too, about the income. So the income comes into the trust fund, and in the end, the trust fund is either paying a recognized obligation that's been approved by the DOF, or it gets forwarded to the taxing entity. Is that an oversimplification? I'm sure it's an oversimplification.
It is truly an because we've only made the one payment to the tax entities, but I think you have to look at it from, there's still some audits, some reviews that are gonna occur to show how much we have in unobligated cash that will be ultimately sent over to the state for, and so as those things happen over the next year, it will be a lot cleaner going forward, that when you do see that revenue coming in, and you see the direct offsetting expenses, that the other money that's left over will be spent on the other obligations to reduce the requirement from the trust fund.
And then that reduction in the trust fund ends up going to the taxing entity.
Correct. At the end of the day, yes, that is correct.
Any other questions? Okay, we have the speaker, Mr. Kidwai.
Nick Kidwai, resident of Dewberry Park, representing concerned citizens, Thousand Oaks, Honorable Chair. The interesting thing is the big white elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. I'm talking about AB 27 times 1. Cannot even say it right. And the state government has not really ruled on it. Like I told you, the DOF has no jurisdiction on non-ROP items, and you have a paid consultant who should really describe to you what AB 27 does, what the 1484 changes are. It does not affect the key provision of that, which you folks have not addressed, and I hope it comes to bite you in the back, is that there's a drop dead date of August 2011. After that, no changes, no contracts are allowed. This project was basically purchased in order to take the money away from the RDA fund, because everybody knew, and everybody has done this, or most of agencies, so that the money would not go to the state. And I mean, there are so many disgusting things. I'll just give you one example. I found this in my records. This is a building, right? Not a good picture, but good enough. The big building that's owned by an Iranian doctor that has put a nice 2-story building. He was never notified about the purchase by the city. I was the one that notified him, and he thought I was trying to pull his chain. And what is this? This is the red action of the Caruso project. I mean, so you lease these things, and then when a citizen asks for details of it, it's state secret. And then staff is so happy to have a puff piece written by a rag locally that they say, well, in this year the return on Caruso was 6.5%, the other year it was 17.5%. And for 5 years they have refused to let us or other citizens know about this. I wrote this in January, and I just quickly, there's hardly any time. Dr. Glancy said that, that the reason for the purchase was so that he can control what happens next door. I hope, and I address this to the controller's office, to the governor's office, I hope you watch the whole hearing. Hardly any of them agencies are putting this on the agenda. Do your due diligence. The students at Ventura colleges, the students at CSUN, the court people, everybody is suffering in the state because they are wasting tax dollars because they consider it free money. We have to put an end to it, and we need to block these 3 projects. Excuse me, the other one is the Auto Mall sign, Auto Mall road improvements, as well as the Caruso. You have made changes to the DDA and zoning under 2711. It's not allowed. It's not allowed. Come on, let's step up to the plate and do what's right and what's legal.
Thank you, Mr. Kidwai.
If you want to have Mr. Fletcher address the current disposition, maybe the next 27.
Well, that's probably Are we gonna talk about that in the legislative?
I'm not sure whether 26 or 27. 27 was invalidated by the Supreme Court.
The speaker was referring to
26.
27.
27, you meant 26.
26.
Yeah, I'm waiting for a motion. Anybody have anything to?
I move we would authorize staff to renegotiate the leases and bring them back to us for approval at a later date.
It's determine whether they should be renegotiated. Second on that?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Barstay, for making the motion. I was just sitting here waiting for something. All right, informational items, and we are going to have Mr. Prescott, our Community Development Director, talk about give us the legislative update.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. You do have our written report, and it does highlight what we consider to be the key provisions of AB 1484, which was approved by the legislature and signed by the governor about a month ago, and you've already had kind of a practical experience with a couple of those provisions, but I'm just going to run through them real briefly. One is the catch-up process, and that was for payments that the state felt the agency should make for obligations earlier than the ROPS period, and that's been completed. We wound up paying about $2.6 million. Many other redevelopment agencies in the state paid substantial amounts of money, and there are some controversies about those. In our case, we did agree with the county auditor that that was the correct amount of money. The new audit provisions, that would be really kind of the next big item that staff will be working on, and that is to audit the funds and assets of first the Low and Moderate Income Housing Fund, and secondly the former Low and Moderate Income Housing Fund, and secondly the assets of the all other assets and funds of the former redevelopment agency. And there's different time schedules for bringing those before the Oversight Board. For the former Low and Moderate Income Housing Fund, we will be bringing those to you, the findings of those audits, which must be done by an independent accountant that the successor agency will hire. We'll be bringing those to you in September or October. They need to be reviewed by the Oversight Board and then sent to the state by October 15th. The other funds, I believe, come in around January 15th, so in the December timeframe, we will have the result of that accountant review to the Oversight Board. The goal of all of this is the finding of completion, and that is what the state is requiring for all redevelopment agencies, and Mr. Adams referred to what it takes to get that finding of completion. And it basically got everything away. It's sending the state the money that, or the auditor controller the money that the state says is due from redevelopment agencies, and that will be the result of those two audits that will be coming before the Oversight Board. And then once an agency or a successor agency receives a finding of completion, there's a couple of real important benefits of that, if you will, under the AB 1484. Number one is that an agency can, with the approval of the Oversight Board, expend unencumbered bond proceeds. That is, when bonds were issued, some of the monies have been spent, but the others were being reserved for projects where there was not yet an enforceable obligation, at least in the eyes of the state. And we will then be able to come to the agency with, or to the board with projects that the bonds were originally intended to fund, and with the board approval be able to spend that money. And then secondly, the real property assets, and we kind of alluded to this a little bit in the agenda item you just completed, but once an agency has received its finding of completion, then it has the ability within 6 months to come to the Oversight Board with an asset management plan. And that can take a little bit longer range view of the assets, the provisions of AB 26 that relate to disposing of the assets as soon as possible for the most possible money. Those are no longer applicable. It's the asset management plan, which again has to come before the board, has to be approved by the board. We will be providing you information about all the assets and how we think those should best be managed. And again, the best management may involve certain assets that were intended for public use being transferred to the city, for example, and other assets managed for future redevelopment. I think the west side properties that we just spoke of is a very interesting example. Those properties were purchased for future redevelopment, and the city has some very concrete plans for those properties. And I think we need to take a kind of a longer range view of when those plans are going to come to fruition and how we can maximize the value of that asset over time, not necessarily the immediate short-term gains. But again, that's part of an asset management plan. It has to be approved by the Oversight Board. The timing of it is after we receive our finding of completion, which would hopefully be next spring, I think probably about April, and then we have 6 months to do the asset management plan. So those are the key highlights of AB 1484, and I can answer questions, or perhaps other staff members or your own attorney.
Do we have any questions? All right, let's move on to the next item. Mr. Prescott.
Yes, yeah, the next item is just, is information only. One of the requirements of AB 1484 is that the housing successor entity, which in our case is the City of Thousand Oaks itself, and which owns all the housing assets of the former redevelopment agency, is required to provide information about all of those assets to the State Department of Finance by September 1st. On forms to be provided by the state, which came out last Thursday. And we've attached, just for your information, if you look at packet pages 91 and 92, at the end of that report, a listing of all the assets. As you can see, the state is, the state of California is defining assets very broadly, including such things as affordable housing covenants that we are beneficiaries of, we the former redevelopment agency, accounts receivable, etc. So we'll be putting all of this information into the forms that the Department of Finance issued last week and submitting them up to DOF. I'm sorry, it's by August 1st. So, yeah, that's right. September 1st is when the ROPS needs to go up. So we do have all the information compiled, and now it's a matter of making sure it fits in the right format that the state has just issued, and that'll be going up next week.
John, is some of these housing assets, do they end up in the asset disposition plan that you're going to present to us? Or is it a completely separate issue?
It's a completely separate issue. These are assets not of the city as successor redevelopment agency. These are assets, housing assets of the city as the successor housing entity. Under AB 26, the housing assets and obligations and functions relating to affordable housing were separated off. And either the city that formed the redevelopment agency could take on those obligations, or under the original legislation, they would automatically revert to the housing authority if the city didn't want them. And that was a separate decision from the city becoming the successor agency for redevelopment. And the city decided to take the housing assets, they now belong to the city as successor housing entity, and then there's a separate track for reporting those assets. Although the audit of the assets will come before you, as I mentioned, in the September, October time frame for you to approve that.
What is our authority over those assets as an oversight board, or do we have any?
Well, let the attorney speak, but in my opinion, you don't have any.
I agree. I mean, that's actually the same deal. As the oversight board, you don't have an official role over disposition of the housing assets.
Is there the possibility that some assets would have been moved that would have been under our jurisdiction to the Housing Authority Board? I'm not suggesting anyone is doing anything untoward, but can that occur?
Not legally.
Okay.
Not legally, but I think that's probably part of the
I mean, subject to interpretation, not
No, but just to address it in a general sense, because I think that's probably part of the reason that the AB 1484 included a provision like that, just to make sure that the assets that were transferred to the housing successor really were housing assets. And there's some gray areas with mixed-use projects and that sort of thing. So by all of the agencies, housing successors having to report the assets to the State Department of Finance, then they look at all of those and they have to approve that list, and if they can challenge items on the list, and if there was something that really wasn't a housing asset, they can direct it be transferred over to the redevelopment successor agency and dealt with in the same vein, the assets under your jurisdiction are being dealt with.
It's treated a lot like a ROPS, this document, these forms that you're.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah, it is, you know.
So in terms
And it
of,
does require State Department of Finance approval.
in terms of understanding our role then with all of this, we do not have oversight responsibility for housing assets, but by looking at an independent audit, it gives us, in theory, confidence that what's in the housing assets should be in the housing assets and shouldn't be under our control as a successor agency.
Right,
That's
because
the purpose. The state wants to know that, and as an oversight board, we should know that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody needs to be clear on what assets are going to be disposed of through the dissolution process and what assets the city is going to be retaining for housing purposes.
There was a question that came up on one of the other oversight boards, on whether or not legally the oversight board even had the authority to make a decision to sell any of those housing authority assets. And it seemed, at that oversight board, it still seemed to be unclear whether that could even be done.
Go ahead. I was gonna say, under AB 26, it was, I think it's pretty clear that as long as the successor agency properly traced, this goes back to 20% money, 20% low mod housing funds. We traced everything. The city had to, or the successor agency had to go back and trace the source of those funds. If the property was acquired with 20% money, then it went to the successor housing agency authority of the city, which it doesn't have an oversight board function, and then the 80% money, we call it, falls under your jurisdiction. So my understanding still is, I mean, again, like everything about this, there's a lot of interpretations as the language, this legislation is not particularly well written, but as long as, I think that's, as long as the successor agency has properly traced the source of funds, and that's why the audit, you will be able to determine that, and you're entitled, and you should, as the oversight board, you should be made aware of that. Then I don't think you have a role in the decision about what to do with the housing assets. I was going to say, there's still you've read everything about how the legislature thought was going to happen with AB 26 and 27, and this never was going to really happen. Likewise, there was a lot of belief at the time that there would be something else to happen with that affordable housing program statewide, billions and billions of dollars invested, wasn't just going to end, and those assets would be distributed. The idea, that's something is why the statute left it with the city, because cities have housing, many cities of course have housing authorities, and there's regional housing authorities also, and so the low and mod housing program would continue in some form, even though the 80% traditional redevelopment would go away. But that's why statutorily it's been split up the way it has. You want to add something?
Yeah. The other, I hope you're able to understand that. The other key point here, if you look at the staff report on the first page, or page 89 of the packet under background, second paragraph clarifies that on January 24th, 2012, the city of Thousand Oaks designated itself as the housing entity. So the city has authority over the housing assets and the housing issues, not the oversight board. So perhaps that other municipality, they hadn't done that. I don't know. Okay. So, and then the other board member had asked about, can you take housing assets and move them into the redevelopment agency, or other way around, I'm sorry, take redevelopment stuff, move it into housing. You can't do that, because the law, the old redevelopment law was very clear about the 20% set aside monies, and that's what the attorney was commenting on. Then there's another point I'd like to make for clarification too, because questions were asked about, well, is this stuff for expenses that are going to happen, and then what about after the expenses happen? As a reminder, the successor agency has the appropriation authority over the funds. So it'll approve a budget, not the oversight board. You're advising on the ROPS and some other things as designated by law, but the actual budget is by the successor agency at the beginning of the year, just like council does it for the beginning of the year or a school board for the beginning of the year. At the end of the year, we have an audit done and a financial report generated. We share that with the successor agency. We will also share that with you, even though you don't have authority over that legally or technically, that will be shared with you. So going back to Mr. Wilmer's question, you will see exactly how the money was spent. Does that provide clarity on that? We got multiple entities or multiple boards now weighing in on stuff. And if that's not clear, we'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. Thank you.
Scott, just probably more appropriate for, to John Prescott, John Adams, you know, at some point, as it starts to evolve, a little flow chart that you could take us through one day. I don't mean a really, you know, but who does what, that would be really helpful, because I'm just hearing this stuff now and I'm saying, okay, so the city council's in charge, is city council and the city the successor agency, they do the budget, we do certain things, the city is the successor housing agency, does certain things. And I guess I'm not as interested in the flow chart as just as for us to do our job, having a better understanding of the limits of our authority and how that authority interacts with the other agencies involved would be, you know, would be of interest.
We'd be happy to do that, and remember, above all of us is the State Department of Finance, who can do pretty much what it wants. So we'd be happy to provide that. We'll have that in the next packet.
Yeah, when it's practicable, as they say. I mean, I'm not expecting to see it at the next meeting if that's going to be difficult.
Oh, it would be helpful for us too.
All right, item 8C. No. Mr. Prescott, item 8C is due diligence review of unobligated balance in former redevelopment agency.
Right, and we've kind of touched on this. This is the one of the requirements of the new law is that we hire a licensed accountant who is approved by the county auditor controller, and we identify the one we'd like to hire here in the report to do those audits, first of the low and moderate income housing fund assets, and then secondly of all other assets and funds of the former redevelopment agency. And the timing for bringing the low and moderate income housing fund assets to review, it's called a review, it's not an audit, to the oversight board will be by October 1st, and then the oversight board approved list must be submitted to the Department of Finance by October 15th. And it will actually take 2 meetings of the oversight board to go through that, because one of the requirements of the law is that before you actually act on it, at least 5 days prior to that, you have to have a public meeting to discuss it and take testimony on it. And then the same process will repeat in December, January timeframe with the second review, the one for all non-housing assets and funds, which has to be submitted to DOF with the oversight board's approval by January 15th. And once those are in place, and once the Department of Finance has approved those, that is the key prerequisite to receiving the findings of compliance. And also, of course, paying the money that it says that we need to pay.
Yeah.
And that is all anticipated, I think, to be done by April, as Mr. Adams alluded earlier.
Any questions? All right, the Thousand Oaks Boulevard Utilities Underground Project Design. Mr. Preston?
Yes, this is just another information item. One of the provisions of AB 1484 will allow successor agencies with the approval of the oversight board to utilize unencumbered bond proceeds and spend them for the purposes for which the bonds were issued in the first place. And that is a decision the successor agency with oversight board approval makes once we've received our finding of completion. So we're not talking about anything that's going to come before the board until next spring at the earliest. But we wanted to give you a heads up, if you will, that one of the projects that was identified in the bond issue, or we do have unencumbered bond proceeds, is the undergrounding of utilities along Thousand Oaks Boulevard between Duesenberg Drive and the eastern city limits, which is the end of the redevelopment project area in that area. And the city has been taking some actions to move that project forward. There's quite lengthy design process that needs to be undertaken by Southern California Edison. So attached to my report on this matter is a report that went to the city council, acting as a city council on July 10th, appropriating money and agreeing to pay Southern California Edison for the design. And the anticipation is that once we receive our certificate of completion and come back to the oversight board, if the oversight approves it, there will be a project to allow us to use those unencumbered bond proceeds for this project. And the cost that the city has incurred will be reimbursable from those bond proceeds, subject to an agreement that again will have to be approved by the oversight board. But we wanted you to be aware that we're looking kind of forward with our planning. It's part of the dissolution of the agency, spending, if we're able to, those bond proceeds for projects for which they were intended.
Question, in all the volumes of paper that you all have given us, have you given us a copy of the original bond paperwork, if you will, that said what the intent of
Part of
sale of the bonds was?
Yeah, part of the ROPS CD that you originally had was the bond indenture, which had all the documentation there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, this is a project that you'll be familiar with from ROPS 1 and ROPS 2 that the state bounced. The expenditure of those bond proceeds for this project, and then also in the Newberry Road project area, the Kelly Road deal with the school district. So those were bounced by the state because we didn't have a enforceable obligation. And in our arguments to the state, we gave them copies, and it's on the CD with our original ROPS, copies of those bond covenants to say, hey, wait a minute, this is the money was issued, those bonds were issued, it was for this project, and we need to spend it, and it's an obligation. They didn't agree, but in the interim, since their decision on those ROPS, the state law has changed, and it provides an avenue with oversight board approval to actually be able to spend those monies for those projects.
So the legislature agreed with you even if the Department of Finance didn't, so to speak?
Not agreed with us, but
Agreed with the
Yeah.
agreed with the principle.
yeah, and I think, Mr. Mitnick can tell you of his conversations with DOF, and I think there was even some confusion up there about whether the original law would have allowed it, because we were told in our conversations with them that yes, unencumbered bond proceeds could be retained and could be spent for the purposes intended, and it came as a little bit of a shock when we sent the ROPS up and they said no. And there's a number of phone conversations and actual missions to Sacramento to try to get them to hold to what they told us in the first place. But now the law has been completely clarified on that matter, and it does, it's just not automatic. You have to do certain things required by the law to get the certificate of completion, and then you can go, you develop your projects, and you go to the oversight board for the approval to spend on those projects.
So to clarify, the Department of Finance said no to this, because I thought it sounded familiar, because it was on the first two ROPS, and I didn't read everything that was on the CD, although I don't remember most of it. So what the law essentially does is just giving you the second bite of the apple, but we're the deciders instead of the Department of Finance. Is that my?
I'll answer that. Not exactly. In this case, we have two projects that were delineated in bond issues. Let's talk about this one. And we put this item on for informational purposes, so you are aware because the council acted on it. Didn't want you to be caught off guard. 2005, the redevelopment agency issued tax-exempt bonds, and it delineated projects that it would spend the money on, or at least was eligible to spend the money on. And one of them was the undergrounding of the utilities on the boulevard. It was clearly delineated. There were even newspaper stories about this at the time. Then we were moving forward, and we've explained this to you. I know we have, because I stood up there and walked you through it. And we had representatives from the school district, Westlake Elementary, or Westlake High School in particular. So, and the superintendent knows this. This project was long in the works.
It's for the stadium, right?
Well, the stadium is a partial beneficiary. It's the high school as a whole, and then for public safety along the boulevard and aesthetics and so on. So this project has long been delineated. The reason we did not move on the project right away in 2005 is we were waiting for the boulevard specific plan to be done and decided on, because that called for a number of improvements to the boulevard. So we didn't want to go through, start tearing up the streets to underground utilities if in fact there were going to be streetscape and landscape and parking improvements done on the boulevard. In retrospect, I wish we would have just done the project. So this was in the works for many years, predating this legislation, AB 26 or 27. On April 9th, Finance Director John Adams and myself did go up and we met with 3 auditors from the State Department of Finance, and we've shared this with you. We went through our projects, and they were very clear to us, and they said, quote, "You are good. These projects are eligible. We'll recommend approval." Words exactly to that effect, all 3 of them, and one of them was a very senior level person. So we walked away from that meeting, okay, we have clarity on this. Those projects that were delineated in bond proceeds as delineated, they're good. The other big project was in the Newberry Road redevelopment project area with bond proceeds from a 2002 bond issue. This was not this was not taxable, like the other one was taxable. This one was tax exempt. This was to help the school district with the acquisition and relocation of the Kelly school, the continuation school on Kelly Road, as well as the bus or the maintenance facility in the back, and then a family entertainment center was going to go on that site. And I believe that was like $3.8 million of bond proceeds. There were going to be other monies from other sources. So that's the history of this. And AB, 1484, clearly says that bond proceeds of these 2 examples are protected. That's what outside attorneys are telling us, that's what the lobbyists are telling us, and that's what our senators and assembly members are telling us. So we have pretty good clarity on this issue. And we will go forward. We do go to the state first, right, John? We have to get, John Adams, we have to get, I think, an okay by the State Department of Finance, and then we'll put it on the ROPS, and then we come back to you. And then from there, it'll go back up to the state.
Actually, we just had the same question. The okay from the Department of Finance is before the certificate of completion then?
John will clarify.
Well, I think that's what we're talking about. The certificate of completion is from the DOF,
yes,
based on meeting certain requirements up through, including payment by April 10th. So that approval I would expect in the spring of 2013. So at that point, that will allow us to move forward on those projects.
Okay, but I guess my confusion, and just, because I'm not arguing the merit of any of the projects. I have never done that. I mean, but unfortunately, the law has thrown a monkey wrench into all of our plans. It's called life. It's just like, you know, you might have $1 million house that 2 people are contributing to, you get divorced, the judge splits the house and sells it. So the question is, if this goes to the Department of Finance for a certificate of completion, the Department of Finance issues that, then we still have to approve it because it would be on the ROPS? I mean, well, we would be asked to, we don't have to, but the fact that we're being asked to means that there is some sort of volition on our part, I'm assuming.
Well, I think and I'll refresh, or maybe the Oversight Board Attorney can has a more immediate knowledge, but my understanding of the law is that once we receive our certificate of completion, we can spend the bond proceeds, unencumbered bond proceeds, on projects for which they were issued, subject to Oversight Board approval. And I think that probably means that you would look at that and say, yes, that was mentioned in the bond issue covenants, and it's eligible for you to spend the money on that. as opposed to us dreaming up new projects, if you will.
Okay.
Yeah, the answer is yes, is that the board's role will be, when that day comes, to approve or not approve the use of the bond proceeds. You'd have the discretion to recommend that, that not do the project, and one of the options then becomes refunding the bonds. But you don't choose the project, they bring it to you, the staff, the successor agents will bring it to you and ask for your assent or consent to use the bonds proceeds with the two projects.
And if
That's
the,
delineated in AB 26.
if the successor, I mean, if the oversight board declined to do that, then the money would just be refunded to the bondholders. It does not go in go back to the state and redistributed to, the people who would normally get the proceeds from.
And this is why these unexpended bond proceeds became such an issue, and why the 1484 was needed to amend it. That same, on the CD with the bond certificate, the bond indenture documents, the process of quote-unquote collapsing the bond issue can be complex, expensive. There's cost issues there. So I think when the day comes, and the question of whether the oversight board should recommend to the successor agency to do it or not, you'll have to take into consideration the alternatives. It may not be economically feasible. It may not even be permissible, depending on the terms of at the time, and the terms of the bond indenture. But those would be the options. And that releases debt service money currently going into the trust fund from the property for former redevelopment tax increment that would be available to go to taxing agencies.
Because I'm trying to figure out what is the revenue stream that we would even have any.
Right. It becomes the bond. What you'll get is sometime next year, this goes forward, a ROPS that will show these expenditures and the bond and the debt, the interest, principal and interest payments being made on the bonds. If you eliminate the bond issue, call the bonds, that expenditure goes away.
Thank you.
But I was going to add, that whole process is complex, so it really has to be discussed in the context when that comes up.
And it also would depend on when those bonds are callable.
Right.
We had this discussion, the mayor, you were with us when we were in Sacramento. Some of the Department of Finance accountants think that AB 26 supersedes all other law in this country, and it doesn't in terms of municipal bonds. It depends on when they're eligible to be refunded. We think that's all a moot point because the bonds, the proceeds are spelled out. Sorry for the long-winded answers, but this illustrates the complexity of the issue.
Maybe I can refer the board to packet page 74 at the top. The first full paragraph, paragraph C1, and then below that C2. This is a section of the law that deals with the unencumbered bond proceeds. And it says bond proceeds derived from bonds issued on or before December 30th, 2010 shall be used for the purposes for which the bonds were sold, and then the following paragraphs describe how that takes place.
Chapter 9.
So if for some reason they couldn't be used for a project that was identified in the bond covenants, then they'd be used to defease the bonds.
And when you read further down, it talks about the successor agency or the oversight board approving them as part of the ROPS, and ultimately there's going to have to have contracts or obligations created, which also would be approved by the oversight board. But again, that one sentence says shall be used for the purposes for which the bonds were sold. So when we talk about what the oversight board is going to be doing, it will be putting it on the ROPS and awarding those contracts, but won't be putting it on the ROPS until those obligations or contracts are approved.
All right, and then our last item is update on compliance audit.
Yeah, actually we put this on the item Mr. Dorsey, but I wanted to talk briefly because there was a lot of discussions about audits and whether assets were properly tracked and managed and stuff like this. And this really goes back to the compliance audit. AB 26 required a compliance audit. That compliance audit needed to be completed by July 1st of 2011. We had the field work done here at the city in May of 2012, which was just a few months ago. That was done by Brown & Associates, who was hired by the County Auditor Controller. That audit would have been completed and provided to the board by July 1st, except for AB 1484 changed the timeline on that compliance audit. So the final audit will not be in front of you until probably our next meeting. At the last board meeting, Mr. Dorsey, June 27th, asked what the status of that compliance audit was. It's currently with the County Auditor Controller for final approval. When we talk about the transfer of housing assets and making sure that we've been complying with the law, that is what the compliance audit is doing. This is an independent auditor who's been hired by the county to ensure that actions that have been taken by the successor agency are in compliance with the law. Having an individual, a CPA, come in and ensure that they performed a lot of agreed upon procedures. Ultimately, I think there was, I'd say, 3 findings, timing issues and stuff like that. Like, for instance, when the first board meeting occurred and the first ROPS was approved was after the law. So the update on the compliance audit is you'll see the compliance audit the next time we're in front of the board. Also part of our other due diligence, and I want to focus on this because there was a lot of discussion about how assets are being managed, transferred, and accounted for. The city recently just completed the financial audit for the redevelopment agency through January 31st, 2012. That report is being finalized right now and printed. That will be also in front of you. So that will be the financial audit of the agency as of January 31st, 2012. Part of the recommendation on 8B was, or I think it's 8C, the due diligence. We will hire an independent auditor, CPA, to come in and do exactly what the board was asking questions of. How do we know which assets went where? We provide you the housing assets, not because it needed board approval, but because we want to make sure that we provide you a summary of what we're trying to deal with. The law is not clear on the requirement for the board approval, but we thought that would be a good suggestion to